I'm very honored and moved to be here with you, and very grateful to the Saloojee Trust for inviting me and giving me this chance of meeting the people in South Africa. Now, as you know, of course, Latin America and Africa have a long common history, yes? Because you know that a large part of the population in many countries in Latin America is of African descent, slave descent. This is particularly the case of the country where I was born, Brazil, but also of many other countries, particularly in the Caribbean, and also Venezuela, of my friend, the ambassador. So the history of our continent is intimately linked to the history of Africa. Yeah? In fact, slavery shaped the history of Latin America, and since the 16th century. And its consequences are still felt today in racism, social exclusion, and brutal police repression against the people of African descent. Yeah? Now, the official history of Latin America is written by the victors, yeah? The conquerors, the slave owners, the colonial powers, the ruling classes, and this is what people learned in schools for a long time. Yeah? But there has been also attempts to do a different sort of historiography, what the German Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin called to brush history against the grain, yeah? To write history from the viewpoint of the oppressed. And there have been some important attempts to do this in Latin America. One of the first was not a book, it was a painting, yeah? A mural painting by Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican muralist painter. I'm really sorry I cannot show it to you. It depicts the resistance of the indigenous tribes against the Spanish invaders, the Spanish conquerors. Huh? That was in 1930. And many years later, in the 1970s, a well-known Latin American writer, Eduardo Galeano, wrote a book, famous book called The Open Veins of Latin America, which tells the history of the continent from the viewpoint of the people, of the oppressed, the history of what one could call, and again I quote the Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin, the tradition of the oppressed. Yeah? There is a history of the oppressors, but there exists also the tradition of the oppressed. The tradition of 500 years of popular black and indigenous resistance against colonialism, imperialism, and all forms of oppression. Yeah? And particularly in this tradition of the oppressed, there are some great moments of anti-slavery rebellion. And two of them are still today beacons of light for the people in Latin America. Two of them. One is in Brazil, 17th century, 18th century, Quilombo dos Palmares, a maroon republic of fugitive slaves who lasted for almost a century in spite of attacks by the Portuguese, the military, and slave drivers, etc. It resisted for almost a century. Finally, it was defeated, and its last leader, Zumbi dos Palmares, was killed by the Portuguese slave drivers. Yeah? So, but this remains in Brazil and for all Latin America a strong symbol of resistance. And the other rebellion, anti-slavery rebellion, of course, is the rebellion of the black Jacobins under Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, which abolished slavery in the 18th century. Now, after beginning in the 19th century and of course in the 20th century, capitalism replaced slavery by modern forms of exploitation. In Brazil, it lasted a long time. Slavery was only abolished at the end of the 19th century. Well, but did this new form, this more modern form of domination and exploitation, capitalism, did capitalism bring democracy to Latin America? Question mark. In fact, during the 20th century, democracy has been rather an exception than the rule in Latin America. And one can ask the question, what is the relation between capitalism and democracy? I think this is a fundamental question for political theory. Now, let me quote from an essay on bourgeois democracy in Russia, written in 906, at the time of Tsarism, yeah, and the first Russian Revolution, which was defeated. Yeah. So, in 1906, this person wrote, I quote now, and you will guess who wrote it. Yeah? I quote, yeah, "It is highly ridiculous to believe that there is an elective affinity between grand capitalism today, as it is presently imported into Russia in 1906, and well established in the United States. Is there any elective, it's ridiculous to believe any affinity between this grand capitalism and democracy or liberty in all possible meanings of the word. The real question should be, how are these things, liberty and democracy, even possible on long term under capitalist domination?" End of the quote. Is democracy and liberty really possible on the long run under capitalist domination? That's the quote. Now, who said this? Who said this very insightful comment on the deep contradiction between capitalism and democracy? It could be Lenin, it could be Trotsky, it could even be Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov, but it was none of them. In fact, it is a quote from Max Weber, the well-known non-Marxist, not to say bourgeois sociologist. Yeah. Max Weber never developed this insight. It just appeared like this in one of his writings. But I think he was right to suggest that there is an intrinsic contradiction between capitalism and democracy. And the history of Latin America in the 20th century is a striking confirmation of this viewpoint. Because very often in the history of Latin America, when the power of the ruling classes, of the oligarchies, yeah, seemed to be threatened by the people, democracy was just pushed aside as a luxury then that one could not afford, yeah, and was replaced by various forms of dictatorship, particularly military dictatorship. And this was a case, several moments in Latin American history, but particularly during the 60s and 70s. Yeah? As Peter Jacobs already mentioned, yeah? We had this succession of military coups in the 60s and 70s. One of the reasons was Cuban Revolution. Yeah? The Cuban Revolution, which not only defeated dictatorship and established democracy, but also went in a confrontation with imperialism and took the road towards socialism. So this appeared as a threat to all the ruling classes in Latin America, and they decided that to prevent something like this, such a terrible socialist revolution in their countries, the only way is to establish an iron power, the iron heel of military dictatorship. And this happened in 1964 in Brazil, in 1973 in Chile, as Peter Jacobs mentioned, against the Salvador Allende socialist government, and in Uruguay, and in Argentina, etc., etc. So, now, the people tried to resist, and resistance took, in several of these countries, the form of armed resistance, guerrilla warfare, following the inspiration of the Cuban Revolution and of Che Guevara's writings. But in most of the countries, this armed resistance against dictatorship was defeated. And in the process, this military dictatorship exterminated any opponents. So you had in Brazil hundreds of people who were killed. In Chile, there were thousands of people killed. And in Argentina, tens of thousands of people killed for opposing the dictatorship. But popular resistance continued in these countries. And finally, in the 80s, in most of these countries, dictatorships were defeated and some form of democracy was re-established. By the way, at least in one country, the guerrilla warfare was able to defeat the dictatorship. That was in Nicaragua. The Sandinista Front of Liberation in the 70s was able to bring down the Somoza dictatorship, a dynasty who had been ruling Nicaragua for many decades, and this was a very, very significant victory. And in another Central American country, El Salvador, there was also a very strong guerrilla movement, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. They struggled with the military for many years. There were also thousands of people killed by the military, but including the Bishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, because he protested against the repression. But finally, the guerrilla couldn't defeat the military, but the military couldn't defeat the guerrilla either. So there was a peace agreement, and finally, democracy was reestablished in El Salvador. So, from the mid-80s and the early 90s, in most Latin American countries, some form of democracy was reestablished. But this was, I would say, an oligarchic bourgeois democracy without social content, a kind of empty shell. And it was a period of brutal neoliberal policies directed against the majority of the people. And this lasted for many, many years, until finally, at the beginning of the 21st century, started a wave of new popular insurgency, new social movements, new parties, workers' parties, etc. And finally, we had a new period of social and economic change, a new period of leftist governments in Latin America. So let me say a few words about this experience of leftist governments. How far did they go in promoting social and ecological change? I speak of ecological because I think one cannot separate the social and the ecological in the 21st century. Both issues are absolutely related, and a significant process of social change has to confront the ecological challenge, the issue of climate change, which is a threat for the whole humanity. So, in fact, we had two different kinds of leftist governments in Latin America in the beginning, since the beginning of the 21st century. Some of them were more moderate, left center, I would say. This was the case in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Chile, etc., for some time in Paraguay. So these experiences, I would call them the forms of social liberalism, which means they didn't break with the neoliberal economic framework. They remained within the limits of neoliberal policies. They didn't confront the interests of the multinationals, of the finance capital, etc. But at the same time, they implemented some significant redistribution of rent, and they implemented some significant policies in favor of the poorest sections of the population. I would say the logic of these social liberal governments in Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, etc., 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 can be summarized in the following terms. We want to do everything possible for the poor majority of the people on the condition then that one doesn't touch the privileges of the rich minority. So that was the logic of these social liberal governments, but still they were a real improvement for the people, for the poor people, for the workers, for the peasants, etc., in relation to the former right-wing neoliberal oligarchic government. So this was a welcome change, and it lasted, yes, for several years, decades in some cases, and in some cases they are still there. Let's say one example is, of course, Brazil under the Workers' Party government, first of Lula, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and then Dilma Rousseff. Yes, as I said, they took some important measures for the poorest, like the in Brazil called Bolsa Família, the family support. Millions of people were taken out of poverty thanks to this support, but these governments didn't change the basic social economic structures of the country. They didn't really break the pattern of social inequality. Now, there was, however, another kind of experiences of leftist governments in Latin America, which were much more radical. And this is the case of the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, the citizen revolution in Ecuador under Rafael Correa, and the experience of the radical leftist government of Evo Morales in Bolivia. These governments really attempted to break with the new liberal system of policies, and they really confronted the interests of the oligarchy, of the multinationals, and they entered in a confrontation with United States imperialism. They developed something called the Bolivarian Alliance, which included these three countries and some others, and Cuba, the Cuba Socialist Revolution. So this was an alliance against the domination of American imperialism in Latin America. So these governments also took into account the importance of the ecological issue. All of them emphasized that a progressive policy has to take into account the environment. Yeah? But in fact, here there is a serious limitation because all these governments depended heavily for their economic policies on the extraction of fossil fuels. Oil in Venezuela and Ecuador, gas in Bolivia, etc. So this was a problem. Yeah? On one side, they recognized the need of ecological policies, but at the same time, they were heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and we know that fossil fuels are the enemy of humanity because they are responsible for climate change. Yeah? So this was a contradiction. But anyhow, these governments were really interesting experience. For instance, in Bolivia, Evo Morales changed the constitution of the land in order to include the national and cultural rights of the indigenous population. Yeah? And many other measures were taken, and of course, the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela was perhaps the most advanced experiment during this of these leftist governments. And now, of course, we criticize them from the ecological viewpoint for having their economy based on fuel, energy, fuel, the exportation of fuel, fossil fuels. But there was one attempt to do something different in Ecuador under Rafael Correa, and that was the Yasuni Park proposal. So let me say a few words about this because it was an interesting experience. Unfortunately, it didn't last too long. The Yasuni area, Yasuni Park is an area of the Amazonian forest in Ecuador where indigenous communities lived for centuries, and an extraordinary biodiversity, an area of the forest, and under the soil there was oil. Yeah? So the ecological movement and the indigenous movement proposed a plan. They said, the Yasuni Park plan, which said, let us leave the oil under the soil and let us ask the rich countries who pretend to fight climate change and etc. to pay an indemnity to the Ecuadorian people for half the price of this oil. In exchange for us, Ecuador leaving the oil under the soil. So that was the proposal, and the Rafael Correa government accepted this proposal, and for a few years he started to pressure the rich countries to pay this indemnity. But after some years, very few rich countries were willing to do this. They don't like the proposal, they prefer the so-called market of pollution rights and other gimmicks. So finally, not much money was available, and the Rafael Correa government finally retreated and invited some multinationals to exploit the oil of the Yasuni Park project. But it was an interesting attempt, and this is the kind of things which could be done also in Venezuela and Bolivia, not, of course, closing from one day to the other the exportation of oil. This would be impossible, but at least selecting one area and saying, in this area we are leaving the oil under the soil. Anyhow. So what is the situation today? Well, Cuba is the country which has been able to resist, in spite of the economic crisis, the difficulties, the US blockade, all kinds of threats, and of course the difficulties which resulted from the disappearance of the Soviet Union, but still Cuba was, the Cuban revolutionary experience has been able to survive with all kinds of problems, of course, and limitations, but it's still there. And in other countries, there are still leftist governments. Uruguay, yeah? Bolivia with Evo Morales, and of course Venezuela with Nicolas Maduro, and Ecuador, unfortunately, the successor picked by Rafael Correa, it was called Lenin Moreno, took a sharp turn to the right. This Lenin was not Leninist at all. He really went all the road with neoliberalism, so it was quite disappointing. However, there was a positive surprise in Mexico because for the first time in the history of the country, a leftist, moderate leftist, was elected president of Mexico, Manuel López Obrador, and so this is a positive change, of course. Now, let me say a few words on Venezuela, because this is at the moment, of course, the most decisive struggle going on, and we have here our friend, the Venezuelan ambassador present. Yeah? Now, one can make all kinds of criticisms to Nicolas Maduro. Myself, I have criticism, and particularly in relation from an ecological viewpoint. One can also say that his election has been questioned because only 47% of the citizens participated in the vote. Yeah, that was last year. But the truth is that his right-wing opponent, Mr. Guaido, who proclaimed himself the president, was not elected by nobody. Yeah? He was not elected by anybody. And he proclaimed himself president of Venezuela without consulting the Venezuelan people. Yeah? And where his main support is Donald Trump. Yeah? It's not the Venezuelan people, it's Donald Trump. And the local cronies of Donald Trump, such as Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc., etc. Yeah? So, whatever one's opinion of the balance sheet of the Nicolas Maduro government, I have no doubt that the main task today for any partisan of democracy is to denounce the US imperialist intervention. Yeah? Beginning with the brutal economic sanctions, whose victim is, of course, the Venezuelan people, and the threats of military expedition. So I think today democracy in relation to Venezuela means, first of all, letting the Venezuelan people itself solve its internal problems without foreign intervention, and particularly without US Donald Trump imperialist intervention. Yeah, I think this is what we had basically to say about Venezuela. But we will perhaps hear our friend, the ambassador, who will explain this better. Now, the fact is that in spite of, we have still several leftist governments in Latin America which remained, which resisted, but there has been a sharp turn to the right in Latin America. Huh? This turn to the right took the form of, first of pseudo-parliamentary coup d'etat. I don't know how to translate this in English. Huh? Coup d'etat of impeaching elected presidents through the parliament, yeah? Not through a democratic vote, but through pseudo-parliamentary maneuvers. And this is what happened in Honduras, this is what happened in Paraguay, and in Brazil against the elected president Dilma Rousseff. Under all kinds of absurd pretexts, the parliaments, which in Latin America are often very oligarchic institutions, they destituted the democratically elected president in Honduras, in Paraguay, and in Brazil. Yeah? So this was one of the forms of this right-wing turn. Yeah? And the other form, of course, was also the election of extreme right-wing figures in Argentina, in Colombia, more recently in El Salvador, and in Brazil. The worst case being Brazil, where an outspoken partisan of the military dictatorship, a real fascist figure, Jair Bolsonaro, was unfortunately elected. Now, the challenge today for the labor movement, the peasant movement, the left, and all Democrats, yeah, is how to resist this reactionary, conservative, neoliberal, authoritarian, and in some cases semi-fascist or fascist regimes. Yeah? So that is our challenge in many countries in Latin America, and particularly in Brazil, because not because I'm Brazilian, but because Brazil is the largest country in Latin America, and the country who has today the most viciously reactionary and the most fascist-like government in Latin America. Yeah? So, in fact, there is popular resistance in Brazil, and there are two popular coalitions which have been organized in the last time to resist this regime. They have somewhat different orientations. One is a more moderate, the other is more radical, but they very often work together, yeah, because they have a common enemy. Yeah? On one side, we have the so-called, the more moderate is the Popular Brazil Front, which includes the main union leadership, the CUT, the Landless Peasant Movement, the MST, and others, and it's supported by the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the Workers' Party. And the more radical coalition, which is called the Fearless People Front, includes the homeless movement, the indigenous movements, and leftist unions, and it's supported by a more radical party, which is the Socialist and Freedom Party. So these are the main democratic coalitions against the regime, and as I said, most time they work together. Now, it's interesting to emphasize that on the forefront of the struggle for democracy, not only in Brazil but in Latin America, you find young women, yeah? Young indigenous or black women. And I will give, and this, they are on the first line of the struggle of the resistance, and often they pay with their lives for this resistance activity. And let me give just two examples. In Honduras, where this dictatorship was established through a pseudo-parliamentarian coup d'etat, in Honduras there was a strong indigenous movement of resistance against a multinational company around ecological issues to defend water, because water is the source of life for the people, against the projects of the multinational. And the leader of this movement was an indigenous woman, Berta Cáceres. And Berta Cáceres was murdered by thugs paid by this multinational. This became a scandal worldwide, not only in Honduras, in Latin America, and worldwide. And Berta Cáceres is today an international symbol of struggles of the people against the destructive projects, against nature, against our mother nature by multinationals. And in Brazil, recently, just 1 year ago, there was the murder, the assassination, by a gang of former policemen of a young black woman, Marielle Franco. She was an activist for human rights and a socialist councillor at the town of Rio de Janeiro. And she became also a symbol of the resistance of the Brazilian people, the Brazilian youth, the Brazilian black youth, who are the first victims of police and authoritarian military oppression. Now, let me conclude. What are the lessons we can learn from this short review of Latin American history and struggles, from the viewpoint of the oppressed? Well, I think there is one important lesson to be learned, is that as long as the capitalist system prevails, the ruling classes will curtail or even suppress democracy every time they believe their interests are being challenged by serious attempts of social change, and sometimes even very moderate attempts at social change. So this is why I believe, as a Marxist, that the struggle for democracy is also a struggle against capitalism. And here I refer again to this quote by Max Weber, who was not a Marxist, saying there is a deep contradiction between capitalism and democracy. Now, obviously, I'm not going to give any advice to you about South African elections. I'm here to listen to you. I'm very interested to hear your opinions. But I'm not going to tell you what to do, of course. But still, there is another lesson, I think, to be learned from Latin American experience, and this may be relevant for people, not only South Africa, but everywhere, everywhere. And this is the following. Whoever wins the election, not much will change if the oppressed and the exploited don't organize themselves. The only way the only way to get some social and ecological change is when the workers, the peasants, the farmers, the women, the youth, the poor, the marginalized people organize at the grassroots and fight. Yes, not only organize, but also fight. Fight together, not each one separate, but together for their common interests. I think this is a lesson from the history of Latin America. Thank you very much.